God. Why did I take a walk in the big humidity? What was I thinking? It wasn't a smart thing to think. Whatever is. Oh, why? Eerie. So, quick update. No spooks. Next week, I might be streaming, I might not. But it'll be my birthday. So, Mods and I'll be chilling out. But, you don't gotta worry about that for now. Do 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 do. Da 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 da. Da da da. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Oh, weird. I banned someone completely different than... Oh. Wait. Hold on. So... Wait. Interesting. Okay. But I can't see who has how many. Wait. Hold on. How... No, that's definitely the person. Okay, so... Okay. Okay. Yeah, I don't know anything about that, but... You can be... Wait, why isn't the other thing on? Okay, yeah, Zerp. I got to the bottom. Well, I don't know if I got to the bottom of the mystery, but the username of the person we were talking about before didn't change. And I banned a completely different person, which I guess I could just go back to banning. But yeah, no, it looks like they just moved on. Or just haven't been around. They might even still be following, I'm not sure. I'm not even sure how I would check that. If they're not in chat. Maybe followage? No idea. No idea. Just 0. I'd have been here sooner, but my phone went a little off kilter, so I had to restart it. Not a problem, Chad. How you doing, dude? It's been a slow start. I got confused by things. I did ban someone already, so you did miss that. They're still here, though, which is weird. Yo, Zerp. Alright, yeah, what do you guys want to hear? I got stories for days. What are we looking for here? Yeah, it was Anthro. You tried to ban him, I guess, huh? Oh, I finished your presents. I should be putting them in the mail, like, Monday. Sorry about staying up at hours you should be asleep at. I can probably do one for that. Kappa. First thing you do is check who's here. That doesn't surprise me. Corgi's got a 6-shooter for a reason. Yeah. Yeah, you do. Alright. Let's see. What the fuck is this shit? I met the devil on Tinder? Why did I bother to get this book? Okay. No. We're just gonna ignore the fact that I have that shit. Let's see. Try this. Let's see. Here we go. Da 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 da. Da 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 da. Hold on. We'll try. The night the ghost got in. I have no idea if it's about staying up late, but I'll try. Oh, you're gonna like this one, Edgehead. The Night the Ghost Got In by James Thurber. Location, Jefferson Avenue, Columbus, Ohio. 17th of November, 1915. Alright. The ghost that got into our house on the night of 17 November 1915 raised such a hullabaloo of misunderstanding that I am sorry I didn't just let it keep on walking and go to bed. Its advent caused my mother to throw a shoe through a window of the house next door and ended up with my grandfather shooting a patrolman. I'm sorry, therefore, as I have said, that I paid any attention to the footsteps. They began at about 1:15 o'clock in the morning, a rhythmic, quick cadenced walking around my dining room table. Yo, Thunder Kitty. My mother was asleep in the one room upstairs, my brother Herman in another. Grandfather was in the attic, in the old walnut bed, which, as you'll remember, once fell on my father. I had just stepped out of the bathtub, and was busily rubbing myself with a towel when I heard the steps. It's 5 miles from where I live. Oof. They were the steps of a man walking rapidly around the dining room table downstairs. The light from the bathroom shone down the back steps, which dropped directly into the dining room. I could see the faint shine of plates on the plate rail. I couldn't see the table. The steps kept going round and round the table. At regular intervals, a board creaked when it was trod upon. I supposed at first that it was my father and my brother Royer who had gone to Indianapolis, but was expected home at any time. I suspected next that it was a burglar. It did not enter my mind until later that it was a ghost. After the walking had gone on for perhaps 3 minutes, I tiptoed to Herman's room. "Psst!" I hissed in the dark, shaking him. "Up," he said, in the low, hopeless tone of a despondent beagle. He always half expected that something would get him in the night. I told him who I was. "There's something downstairs," I said. He got up and followed me to the head of the back staircase. We listened together. There was no sound. The steps had ceased. Herman looked at me in some alarm. I had only the bath towel around my waist. He wanted to go back to bed, but I gripped his arm. "There's something down there," I said. Instantly, the steps began again, circled the dining room table like a man running, and started up the stairs toward us heavily 2 at a time. The light still shone palely down the stairs. We saw nothing coming, we only heard the steps. Herman rushed to his room and slammed the door. I slammed shut the door at the stairs top and held my knee against it. After a long minute, I slowly opened it again. There was nothing there. There was no sound. None of us ever heard the ghost again. The slamming of the doors had aroused Mother. She peered out of her room. "What on earth are you boys doing?" she demanded. Apparently she's Irish. Herman ventured out of his room. "Nothing," he said gruffly, but was, in color, light green. "What was all that running around downstairs?" said Mother. So she'd heard the steps too. We just looked at her. "Burglars!" she touted intuitively. I tried to quiet her by starting lightly downstairs. "Come on, Herman," I said. "I'll stay with Mother," he said. "She's all excited." I stepped back onto the landing. "Don't either of you go a step," said Mother. "We'll call the police." Since the phone was downstairs, I didn't see how we were going to call the police. Nor did I want the police, but my mother made one of her quick, incomparable decisions. She flung up a window of her bedroom, which faced the bedroom windows of the house of the neighbor, picked up a shoe, and whammed it through a pane of glass across the narrow steps, the narrow space that separated the two houses. Glass tinkled into the bedroom occupied by a retired engraver named Bodwell and his wife. Bodwell had been, for some years, in a rather bad way, and was subject to mild attacks. Most everybody we knew or lived near had some kind of attacks. It was now about 2 o'clock of a moonless night. Clouds hung black and low. Bodwell was at the window in a minute, shouting, frothing, a little shaking his fist. "He'll sell the house and go back to Piora," he could hear Miss Bodwell saying. It was some time before Mother got through to Bodwell. "Burglars!" she shouted. "Burglars in the house!" Herman and I hadn't dared to tell her that it was not burglars but ghosts, for she was even more afraid of ghosts than burglars. Bodwell at first thought she had meant that they were burglars in his house, but finally he quieted down and called the police for us over an extension phone by his bed. After he had disappeared from the window, Mother suddenly made as if to throw another shoe. Not because there was further need of it, but, as she later explained, because the thrill of heaving a shoe through the window glass had enormously taken her fancy. I prevented her. The police were on hand in a commendably short time. A Ford sedan full of 2 of them. 2 on motorcycles and a patrol wagon with about 8 in it and a few reporters. They began banging on our front door. Flashlight shot streaks of gleam up and down the walls, across the yard, down the walk between our house and Bodwell's. "Open up!" cried a hoarse voice. "A men from the headquarters." I wanted to go down and let them in since they were there, but Mother wouldn't hear of it. "You haven't a stitch on," she pointed out. "You'll catch your death." I wound the towel around me again. Finally, the cops put their shoulders to our big heavy front door with its thick beveled glass and broke it in. I could hear a rending of wood and a splash of glass on the floor of the hall. Their lights played all over the living room and crisscrossed nervously in the dining room, stabbed into hallways, shot up the front stairs, and finally up the back. They caught me standing in my towel at the top. A heavy policeman bounded up the steps. "Are ya?" he demanded. "I live here," I said. "Well, what's the matter, ya hot?" he asked. It was, a matter of fact, cold. I went to my room and pulled on some trousers. On the way out, a cop stuck a gun into my ribs. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I live here," I said. The officer in charge reported to his mother. "No sign of nobody, lady," he said. "Must have got away. What did he look like?" There were 2 or 3 of them," Mother said. "Whooping and carrying on and slamming doors." "Yeah, funny," said the cop. "All your windows and doors were locked on the inside, tight as a stick." Downstairs, we could hear the trampling of other police. Police were all over the place. Doors were yanked open, drawers were yanked open, windows were shot up and pulled down, furniture fell with dull thumps. 6 policemen emerged out of the darkness in the front hallway upstairs. They began to ransack the floor, pulled beds away from walls, tore clothes off hooks and closets, pulled suitcases and boxes off shelves. One of them found an old zither that Roy had won in a pool tournament. "Looky here, Joe," he said, strumming it with a big paw. The cop named Joe took it and turned it over. "What is it?" he asked me. "It's an old zither our guinea pig used to sleep on," I said. It was true that a pet guinea pig we once had would never sleep anywhere except on the zither, but I never should have said so. Joe and the other cop looked at me a long time. They put the zither back on the shelf. "No sign of nothing," said the cop who had first spoken to Mother. "This guy," he explained to the others, jerking a thumb at me, "was naked. The lady seems historical." Historical? Do they mean hysterical? They all nodded but said nothing, and just looked at me. In the small silence, we all heard a creaking in the attic. Grandfather was turning over in bed. "What's that?" snapped Joe. 5 or 6 cops sprang for the attic door before I could intervene or explain. I realized it would be bad if they burst in on Grandfather unannounced, or even announced. He was going through a phase in which he believed that General Meade's men, under steady hammering by Stonewall Jackson, were beginning to retreat and even desert. When I got into the attic, things were pretty confused. Grandfather had evidently jumped to the conclusion that the police were deserters from Meade's army, trying to hide away in his attic. He bounded out of bed wearing a long flannel nightgown over long woolen underwear, a nightcap, a leather jacket around his chest. The cops must have realized at once that the indignant white-haired old man belonged in the house, but they had no chance to say so. "Back, ye cowardly dogs!" roared my grandfather. "Back to the lines, ye goddamn lily-livered cattle!" With that, he fetched the officer, who found the zither a flat-handed smack along the side of his head that sent him sprawling. The others beat a retreat, but not fast enough. Grandfather grabbed Zither's gun from his holster and let fly. The report seemed to crack the rafters. Smoke filled the attic. Cop cursed and shot his hand into his shoulder. Somehow we all finally got downstairs again and locked the door against the old gentleman. He fired once or twice more into darkness and then went back to bed. "That was Grandfather," I explained to Joe, out of breath. "He thinks you're deserters." "I'll say he does," said Joe. The cops were reluctant to leave without getting their hands on somebody besides Grandfather. The night had been distinctly a defeat for them. Furthermore, they obviously didn't like the layout some things looked, and I could see their viewpoint phony. In the end, to poke into things again, a reporter, a thin-faced, wispy man, came up to me. I had put on one of Mother's blouses, not being able to find anything else. The reporter looked at me with mingled suspicion and interest. "Just what the hell is the real lowdown here, bud?" he asked. I decided to be frank with him. "We had ghosts," I said. He gazed at me a long time, as if I were a slot machine, into which he had, without results, dropped a nickel. Then he walked away. The cops followed him, the one Grandfather shot holding his now bandaged arm, cursing and blaspheming. "I'm gonna get my gun back from that old bird," said the zither cop. "Eh," said Joe. You and who else?" I told him I would bring it back to the station house the next day. What was the matter with that one policeman?" Mother asked, as they had gone. "Grandfather shot him," I said. "What for?" she demanded. I told her he was a deserter. "Of all things," said Mother. "He was such a nice-looking man." Grandfather was fresh as a daisy and full of jokes at breakfast the next morning. We thought at first he'd forgotten all about what happened, but he hadn't. Over his third cup of coffee, he glared at Herman and me. "What was the idea of all them cops terry-hooting around the house last night?" he demanded. He had us there. Okay, that was fucking hilarious. That was very funny. That was a riot from beginning to end. That was a good one. Yeah, the smiles, what's up? Alright. What else are you wanting to hear? I have an Oxford book of Victorian ghost stories. Of all the things about that, the only unrealistic part was the Irish accent. Yeah, I don't know why I made the mother Irish. I haven't a fucking clue. haven't a clue. Crazy folks with the guns, check. Hapless cops, check. Folks roaming around in robes randomly, double check. Oh yeah. If that were my house, I'd probably be in the same friggin' position. Robes and jumpsuit and Kevlar vests here. Oh, well, yeah, you're in Indiana. It's actually been a minute since we've done a true Irish ghost story. Although I do wonder if there are more since I last swept for them. Hold on. Oh, looks like there have been more. Sorry, hold on. I'm picking up a little bit more stuff here. Interesting. Okay. Now, I'm not finding too much more, but I will grab these to grab later. Okay, finally. Sorry. God. I've just been letting you guys just marinate there. Okay. Let's see. Let's see about... Oh, I chose the wrong one. Shit. Alright, hold on. Sorry. Ah. Okay. Here we go. Oh, right. This is the one without the table of contents. Ah, crap. Okay, hold on. Alright. Here we go. We're getting there. This one's called The Devil's Footfall from County Cavan. Where the road runs up from the village of Black Lion to the crossroads at Golan. I'm probably butchering all these names. There's still an old fort standing, dating back to a dark and pagan times. The locals call it Moneygashel Rock, and it has a very bad name to it. From the back door of the house where I was born and brought up, we could look down over the fields to it, and I recall many nights standing at the corner of the house and watching the place lit up like a town with a strange glow, and no one near it. No one would go near it after a certain time at night for fear of being taken by whatever lived there. At least that's what they said through the countryside. And there may have been some truth in it, for odd shadows used to come and go across the fields to and from the rock. And they said that they came from unseen things that sometimes ventured out and about when lights were changing. There was a family living among the fields many years ago. I remember my father talking about them, called McMahon. They lived in a small lime-washed cottage that stood by the side of a pad road, a turf or mud road, that ran through the fields and beyond Moneygashel Rock. It suited them well enough, or they weren't a big family. A couple of boys and a girl, and the father and mother. Not big for those times. The father was labouring man, but he had notions above himself and fancied himself a bit of a scholar. He was always reading, and although he was a decent enough man, he had a tendency to look down his nose at his neighbours. Not cruelly, you understand, but it was just the way of him. Now, the daughter's name was Mary, and she was about 17 or so, around the time I'm telling you about. And she was sweet on a young boy, one of the Maguires who lived over by Belcoo on the other side of the border, who worked for the Colonel Nixon. Fucking hell. Colonel, how do you fucking say that word? Colonel, it's with an R, but there's no fucking R in the word, but there's an L and two O's that mean nothing. Colonel Nixon. Colonel Nixon. Up above Black Lion. By all accounts, he was sweet on her as well. Her father, however, didn't approve of the match, for there was a big family, the Maguires, and they said that some of them had been in trouble with the police on the northern side of the border. He said that he didn't think the boy was good enough for his daughter, and forbade Mary to see him, saying in no uncertain terms that he wasn't to come about the house. But as has been rightfully said, the more you try to turn the course of romance, the more you'll fail. Mary was a headstrong girl and was determined to keep seeing the boy. And, as also has rightly been said, love will usually find a way. As I was telling you, young Maguire worked for Colonel Nixon, and his road home took him past the end of the pad road that led up to Mary McCann's house. There were times that she was alone in the cottage. The family were sometimes cutting away turf from the moss, and on these occasions she would go down and spread out her apron on a big stone just at the turn. When young Maguire saw it, he knew Mary was waiting for him at the house, and he'd call with her on his way home. That was the sign, you see. One evening the family were away cutting turf in the moss, and Mary was left to look after the house. As soon as the family were gone, she went down the end of the pad road and spread her apron on the big stone to let young Maguire know she was waiting for him. And she went back to the house and to her work. And just as it was starting to get dark, she saw the turf creel by the side of the fire was empty, and went out round to the side of the house to fill it from the stack. The corner of the house lay between herself and the pad road, so she couldn't see who was coming or going, but she'd left the door of the cottage open. As she filled the creel, she heard a footstep coming up the road in the direction of Moneygashel Rock. A slow and leisurely step, like a man taking his ease in the late evening sun, not hurrying himself to get home. Thinking it was the young Maguire on his way home from Colonel Nixon's, she called out to him. "I'm at the turf stack. Go on into the house and I'll be a moment. The door's open." The footstep paused for a moment and then turned into the house. Mary continued to fill the creel before going back into the kitchen. Although she'd expected to find Maguire standing waiting for her, the room seemed completely empty. Thinking that he was hiding and ready to jump out and surprise her, she put the creel down and began to look around. There was nothing. "Where are you?" she called, but there was no answer. "Stop fooling about and show yourself." There was a sound from behind her, and she turned quickly, but it was only a bird easing its throat on the other end of a briar just beyond the open door. "Ah, come on now!" She was starting to get uneasy. Again there was no answer, although she was sure that she had heard the footfall going into the house. She moved from room to room, but the cottage was empty. However, set in a niche above the fire was a little piece of glass that the family used as a mirror as she passed it. Mary thought that she glimpsed her reflection, or something out of the corner of her eye. In the farthest corner of the room, she thought that something watched her very intently, although she couldn't make out exactly what it was. It looked human, but it was completely hairless and naked, with very pink skin. It wasn't moving, but it remained where it was, seemingly following her every movement around the room. However, the image was gone in an instant, and when she turned to look into the glass, there was nothing there at all, but her own reflection. By now, the girl was becoming frightened, and she ran from room to room, trying to find the source of the strange image, but there was nothing there. Then she heard the voices of her family as they made their way back from the moss, coming home to have their supper. Mary said nothing to them as they came in and appeared to notice nothing strange about the cottage. There was one thing, however. None of the dogs which had been with them would come into the house, but stood bristling and growling at the doorway, as if sensing something that they didn't like. No amount of coaxing would bring them in. Finally, Mary's father cursed them and shut them outside for the night. That was the only thing, at least for a while. Later on, when the supper was finished and she was doing the washing up, Mary felt something tug playfully at the ties of her apron, pulling them loose. Thinking that it was a family member, she turned to scold them, but there was nobody there. They were all seated around the fire and well away from her. She turned back and went to the washing, but someone or something poked it and nipped her. It was a faint sensation, but again, when she turned, there was no one behind her. It was all very peculiar. Late that night, the family went to bed. Mary slept in a room at the back of the cottage, which was sparsely furnished and had a large, uncurtained window that looked out over the adjoining fields. It was a bright, moonlit night, and the light streaming in through the window played across the stone flags of the floor. Although she could see that she was alone in the bedroom, Mary had the strangest sensation that there was someone in with her, standing watching her from a corner of the room. Nevertheless, she undressed and got ready for bed and slid between the sheets. As she did so, she got the impression that someone got into bed beside her. She'd blown out the lamp and she lay there in the dark. She was conscious of a faint movement under the bedclothes to her right. She put out her right hand and touched the thing beside her that felt like naked skin and which was deadly cold. There was no mistake. With a loud scream, she jumped out of bed, and as she did so, the clothes on the other side of the bed were thrown back as well. As she stood there in the middle of the floor, a shadow began to form in the moonlight. It came in through the window. It was a tall figure like that of a man, but the arms were impossibly long, and the head was twisted to one side as if the neck were twisted. It stood in the shaft of moonlight, unmoving. Mary's screams had brought in her father and her brother to see what was going on, and they saw the eerie shadow as well. As the light from their lamp fell on it, it seemed to move and writhe as if it had life of its own, its arms waving and forcing them back beyond the doorway. And then it was gone as if it never existed. All that was left was the stone-flagged floor. You may guess that there was not much sleep in the house that night. The experience had been terrifying for everyone, but especially for Mary, who refused to go back in the bedroom, and no wonder. She spent the night in her parents' room, and it was all they could do to get her calmed down. However, she didn't tell them what had happened, and her father was at a loss to explain what the weird shadow had been about. Maybe she hoped that would be the end of it. But it certainly wasn't. The next morning, as she stood by the basin washing the breakfast dishes, something put its arms around her and tried to kiss her on the base of the neck. She turned, but there was nothing there, and as she did so, something unseen pulled the strings of her apron loose and grabbed at her skirt. She jumped back, and as she did so, a couple of burning peats fell from the hearth and danced across the floor. Plates rattled on the dresser, and a cup lifted itself from the table and fell to the flags, breaking into 100 pieces. A pail of water that had been standing by the door lifted itself up and spilled all over the floor, while something chuckled softly somewhere close by. The family never had a bit of peace for the rest of the day. Plates and cups danced along the dresser. Members of the family were pelted with potatoes, mysteriously brought in from outside. Hot peats flew around the room as if they had life of their own. A sheet which had been hung in front of the fire to dry suddenly rose up and formed the shape of a man with his hands menacingly outstretched. It was all so terrifying that at last Mary broke down and told her father what she'd done, and about the strange footfall in the pad road that she'd invited him to the house. She thought it had been young Maguire, but he'd been sent on a message to Enniskillen by Colonel Nixon himself, hadn't come back until late, and had gone straight home. She didn't know what had come in the house. It was some she-ho-gay from thing from Monegashel Rock that was going past in the twilight, her father replied. Such things are always going back and forth before nightfall. And as he spoke, the thing, whatever it was, laughed at him out of a bucket by the fireplace. Although very afraid, her father knew what to do about it. A little way below on the road to Black Lion, he was a retired priest living. He was an old man, but wise, and knew all about ghosts and fairies. It was said that he had performed 1 or 2 exorcisms in his time, and it was to him that Mary's father went. Father Judge, for he was so called, listened gravely to the story. By bringing the being into the house, your daughter has done a very dangerous thing, he said very seriously. These things are not to be trifled with. They're like weeds that take root in a garden. I can tell you that it's as well it came to me now, for if he had waited much longer, it would take 9 priests and 9 bishops to cast it out. Let's see if we can dislodge it ourselves. And he lifted his coat and his Bible and followed Mary's father home. At the cottage, things got worse. Crockery had been smashed from the floor and smouldering peats lay everywhere. Blankets from the bedroom had been pulled out and now danced around the kitchen, taking odd and bizarre shapes which looked like people or animals. Those voices laughed in the buckets and pots. The place was bedlam. Telling the family to stay outside, Father Judge stepped into the middle of its terrible racket. He was a tall man, silver-haired, with a beard like Bible patriarch, and he looked very imposing. Standing in the middle of the kitchen, he raised his hand. In the name of God, be still, he shouted. Burning sods jumped at him out of the fire, and a plate was fired at his head. The old man never flinched. I command in his holy name, he repeated. Things quieted for a moment, although one of the windows rattled in its frame. Away, priest! Shouted a voice from the bucket by the fire. Away, you black crow! What business have you among decent people? And the thing laughed like a mad person. Ren, you had way too much fun with that. A lesser man might have turned in the doorway, but Father Judge didn't let on that he heard it. He opened his Bible to intone the words of exorcism, but it was knocked out of his hand by something that he could not see. Cups rose by themselves and were banged down again on the dresser. Tell me, in the name of God, who are you? Demanded the priest. The voice from the bucket laughed again and made several rude noises. Foony McCarkleton, I replied. Another titter of laughter rang around the cottage. What ails you, Foony? The thing added in another voice, talking to itself. Oh, what ails you, Foony? The thing added in another voice, as if talking to itself. There followed a string of gibberish, some of which was quite obscene, and concerned Father Judge himself. The priest paid such rant no heed, but continued with the rites of exorcism, praying earnestly as he did so. The being whooped and wailed all around him, telling him in a number of voices that there was a spirit of his mother who was now lost and tormented creature, that it was the spirit of a servant man who had lived in the area, who had stolen something from his employer and several other persons. It bleated like a lamb and barked like a dog and caused more peats to jump in the fire. As Father Judge tried to intone the words of exorcism, it threw a potato at him, nearly missing his left ear. There, take that for your trouble, you old crow! The voice from the bucket told him. The priest tried to read the sacred words of exorcism, but was drowned out by the din. I charge you to be gone from this place and to torment these people no longer in the name of God, he shouted. Tins and plates rattled in the pantry. What ails you, Rooney? The thing mocked him, aping his own voice. From hour upon hour, Father Judge wrestled with the terrible thing. He was nipped and punched and hit about the shoulders with lighted sods and pelted with potatoes. And the voice from the bucket continually hurled abuse at him, revealing some things about his past that he'd rather have kept in. A sweat fairly stood on his head, but still the being mocked him. At length he left the cottage and went to where the family waited. It's stronger than I imagined, he admitted to them, but I do know something that will get rid of it. He turned to Mary. The being was invited into the house with both your words and your heart. That's what gives it its strength. Tell it to go. Will it to go, as you have never willed anything before, and it'll go. But you must want it to leave with your heart and soul. I do want this, Mary replied. She was terrified of the terrible thing that she'd brought into the house, and desperately wanted for some peace for herself and her family. So she accompanied the elderly priest back to the cottage, and as soon as she stepped across the threshold to the pandemonium, it started again. Potatoes and eggs flew around the room as though on strings. Crockery rattled and bounced on the sideboard, and animal sounds, the bleating of sheep and barking of dogs, issued from the chimney. Her heart literally stopping within her. Mary walked into the very centre of the chaos and stood there. "Wish it to go with all of your heart," Father Judge instructed her. "You're the one who brought it into this place, and you're the only one who can cause it to go." As he opened his Bible and began to read again, telling the spirit to go, the thing howled and gibbered and threw crockery at them both. And all the while, the sheets and blankets turned themselves into ever more frightening shapes, and danced wildly in the air around them. "Tell it to go," Father Judge told Mary, "and tell it to do so in the name of God. Speak with the authority of the Lord of Hosts." The girl swallowed hard, for the sweat was breaking on her. "Go from our house in the name of God," she commanded. Pete's danced across the floor as Father Judge read another exorcism. "What ails you, Foodie?" asked a voice from the bucket by the hearth, followed by an insane tittering. It was the sound of a woman crying from the chimney and more animal noises. Something like human excrement fell into the fireplace, but Mary stood her ground. "Go on," she shouted. "Go on now." Suddenly everything was quiet again. The plates and crockery stopped rattling on the sideboard. The sounds from the fireplace stopped. Potatoes that had been caught in mid-flight suddenly dropped to the ground, and everything seemed peaceful. Then from outside came another sound. It was the slow, unhurried step of somebody walking away from the cottage, down the pad roads toward Monygashel Rock. It was an easy footfall, like a man taking his time in the late evening sun, and it grew farther and farther away. Father Judge wiped his brow. "Whatever it was is gone," he said solemnly, "but it has left its mark here. The house will have to be ritually cleaned and a mass said here before decent people can live in it once again for any length of time." And that was the way of it. A special mass was said in the cottage, and the place was blessed. There was no further trouble from the creatures of Monygashel, although the McMahon family never really prospered after that. Mary in particular never enjoyed good health and always looked thin and wasted. In the end she married young Maguire, but they had no children, and she didn't live many years after the wedding. Maguire remarried and had a big family, one of the biggest in the area, and his descendants still live in Golan yet. After a while, Mary's family left the cottage and went to live on the other side of Black Lion. They never had any luck. Most of the good fortune was gone from them, you see. They never finished up with either land or much money. That's what comes from messing with the she-huggy creatures. Monygashel Rock is still there in its ghostly place as it ever was. Odd shadows still come and go across the fields around it at certain times of the evening, and there is sometimes a dark coldness that hangs around it like a shroud, except at night, when it's lit up with lights and such. I wouldn't go there for a fortune after the sun goes down. My God, I wouldn't. That was another story of just crazy household shit happening. Harry's always being sweet on the young boy. It's starting to become a bit concerning. Yeah. I mean, she was young too, so... She was young too. Alright, any requests? Something about dragons? I could do that for you, Sassy. Hello! This is from the British Isles. Might be. Alright, this one's called The Two Warring Dragons. Way back in the earliest days of Britain, there was no sense of one united kingdom covering the whole island and no king who could command all the country. And there were no English and no Welsh, no Anglo-Saxons and no Celts. And the Romans had yet to bring their roads and walls into their Christian religion. Way back then, in the time of myths, there were two brother kings. Lephalus ruled a kingdom across the sea, what we now call France, and his brother Lud ruled what is now southern England. There were good kings who ruled their kingdoms well and remained good friends. But Lud had a problem. On the first day of every May, when his people should have been celebrating the end of winter with raucous bawdy spring festival of Beltane, his kingdom was brought to a standstill by hideous screams and shrieks. These noises rang through the skies all over the kingdom, and were impossible to ignore. They were so loud that they made the worst thunderstorm you'd ever experienced seem tame and harmless. They were so terrible they caused brave men to go pale and lose all their strength. Lesser men lay down and died. Women miscarried and animals became barren. The very crops in the field withered and the new fresh leaves fell from the trees. Every year as Beltane approached, Lud's people grew scared. They shut themselves away where they hoped they wouldn't hear the screams, but there was nowhere to escape. They hoped and prayed to their gods that it wouldn't happen again this year, but it always did. And every year the kingdom fell further into rack and ruin. No one could explain the screams or their effect, so no one knew what to do to counteract them. One year, when things had reached a terrifying low, Lud went to his brother Lephalus to see if he could offer any explanation. Lephalus had at his disposal all the best brains in Gaul, and could summon help from all over the continent, and soon he was able to explain Lud's problem. The shrieks and screams, he said, were caused by two dragons engaged in a never-ending battle. As they fought, they roared out their pain and anger. To stop the disaster from happening every year, Lud would have to stop the dragons from fighting. They could not be killed. She'd have to capture and imprison them somewhere that they could never escape. Now that he knew what he must do, Blood returned home and began making the preparations to achieve his aim. The first task was to measure his kingdom from north to south and from east to west, and find the dead center. It turned out to be just outside the town of Oxford. There Lod had a huge watertight pit, or cistern, dug, and when it was complete, he filled it with mead. An enormous brocaded cloth was made to cover the pit. On the eve of Beltane, Lod sat beside the pit and saw two terrifying, unimaginable beasts fighting. As they fought, they changed. They went through every bloodthirsty animal known to man, and many which aren't. They were bears, they were lions, they were basilisks and griffins. They became hounds and wolves, leopards and endless coiling snakes. They grew large, they shrunk small. They tried to trick each other. As night grew old, they changed into dragons and soared into the air to continue their fight. As they swooped and battled, they let out deadly shrieks which had ravaged the kingdom for so long. After a night of fighting, in which the first one and then the other dragon had seemed to have the upper hand, they both sank to the ground by the cistern, where they changed into giant pigs. Smelling the mead, the pigs plunged into the pit and quenched their thirsts with gallons of intoxicating liquid. Then they collapsed in a drunken stupor. Blood was then able to bind them up in brocaded cloth and have them transported away to the distant mountains of North Wales, where they were interred in a cave far under the ground, where they could do no more harm. Lud became a hero to his people and ruled them well for the rest of his life. They thought the threat of warring dragons was a thing of the past, and gradually the suffering they had caused faded from memory. Centuries passed and new peoples came to the country. New wars were fought and new kings ruled. One of these was called Vortigern. Vortigern had made his stronghold in the mountains of Caernarfon in North Wales on an isolated rocky outcrop. He called it Dinas Faparan Dandit, or the Fortress of the Fiery Pharaoh. From there he ruled a wide area of land, but in order to make himself stronger and even more powerful, he needed to expand and strengthen his castle. The trouble was, every time he constructed a new tower or wall, it cracked and tumbled down. Vortigern consulted his advisors, all the wisest sages and cleverest magicians he had at his disposal, and they told him that the only remedy was to find a boy who had no natural father, and to sacrifice him. But what kind of boy has no natural father? Vortigern eventually found one, a young lad called Merlin, whose father was a demon or shapeshifter. So, he was no natural father. Although he wasn't a shapeshifter like his father, Merlin did have more than natural powers, and he was able to explain that Vortigern's advisors were wrong. Sacrificing him would make no difference. The towers and walls kept falling down, he said, because the castle was built over a vast cave in which two warring dragons were trapped. It was their writhing which shook the ground and caused the towers to fall. Following Merlin's advice, Vortigern ordered his men to dig, and sure enough they opened a large underground cavern, from which two vast dragons, one red and one white, soared into the skies and continued their age-long battle. All the people were terrified and fled, except Merlin, who stood by the cavern applauding them on. Eventually one of the dragons was defeated, and fell to earth, where it died. The other gave a great roar of victory, transformed itself into a huge serpent, and crawled off into the earth to await a time that it might return to aid one or other of the peoples of this island. Whether the victor was the Red Dragon of Wales or the White Dragon of England depends, of course, on who's telling the story, so I'll leave you to decide that for yourself. Cool. I have energy for a couple more. Thank you, good fellow, my pleasure. Oh, I have Lovecraft in here. I don't know if I have energy for an entire Lovecraft, but maybe. I don't know, what are y'all on the mood for? Otherwise, I can fire up Inscription. If y'all aren't sick of that yet. I am just half asleep. I could read you a bedtime story. I guess all of this is one big bedtime story. Sleep. Let me see. Let me see. So, too energetic. Let me see. There's folk tales for children. That should help. Alright. It's just finishing up something. You're down for whatever? Alright, let's try the Dragons of Belfast Caves Hill. My friend John Gray told me the story about 40 years ago. Is that old enough to qualify? In all honesty, I don't know. I like it, so I'm gonna tell it, because it explains something I always wondered about. I can't quite remember John's story exactly, so my version might be slightly different. That's what happens with folktales. They change a bit over time. unless they're learned off by heart. Belfast is a beautiful city surrounded by hills. When I was wee, you could stand in the middle of the city and look up and see them. Unfortunately, houses are built on the Castlereagh Hills, so you can't see Green Hills to the east of the city, but you could see Cave Hill. It towers above Belfast and has a huge cliff called Napoleon's Nose. I grew up in Belfast and I often saw small fires on the Cave Hill and wonder what caused them. I asked my mummy if she said it was the farmers burning gorse. I didn't think that was right, so I asked Granda Finlay. Granda said, I think those fires are caused by the magic dragons we can't see. Let's go and have a look and see if we can find out. It's a long walk, are you game? We could bring Scamp. I was game. I loved going off for long walks with Granda. He was fun. He used to do interesting things like call the cows to the gates of the fields and talk to them. He grew up in the country and he knew how to call the cows and what they were saying, and he told me. Mummy said Granda was an old fool, but if I wanted to go with him and look for dragons, that was alright with her. So off we went. It was a long walk up through the Belfast castle grounds and onto the hills, along the steep path past the 3 caves. Grandad told me in the distant past many people were so poor they couldn't afford a house, so they lived in caves. He said naughty people lived in the big cave at the bottom of the cliff. They made it into a shebeen. That's the place where you can buy Mountain Dew, an illegal drink, also called poitin. Wait a second. Wait, stop. Hold on. That's a place where you can buy Mountain Dew, an illegal drink also called poitin? It's the strongest alcoholic drink you can get. It could blow your head off. Wait a second. Chat, remind me to look up the history of Morning Dew. Mountain Dew, rather. I agreed that that was a bad thing. We couldn't blame them. Grandad said, when I was a young lad, you couldn't come into the castle grounds because game warden would have shot you. Lots of people were starving, so they went into big estates like this to hunt rabbits and deer. The people who owned the land lived in big houses and had plenty to eat. They didn't like starving people stealing rabbits and deer, so they put up signs saying trespassers will be shot, and hired gamekeepers to shoot strangers. It didn't matter if the person shot was killed because he'd been warned. Oh, shocked. It was very difficult to walk on the top of Cave Hill. One minute I had to take a big step up and the next step was away down a hole. Granda said, the way the land goes up and down in ridges is what remains of the old lazy beds. I asked what lazy beds were. He said, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, there were so many people living in Ireland, every square inch of land was used to grow potatoes. The people hadn't anything to eat apart from potatoes, so they grew them everywhere, even on top of mountains. You can see the lands up here is very wet. If they planted potatoes in it, they'd rot. Farmers were very crafty. They'd put a line of manure on top of the earth, planted their potatoes on top, dug a trench beside the line and put the earth from the trench on top of the potatoes. It was very clever because the trench drained the water off the land, and the farmers saved time because they didn't dig a whole field, only half of it. That's why they're called lazy beds. There was a great famine in the beginning of 1845. The potato crop failed for several years in a row. Many people either died of hunger or emigrated. Population became so scarce it hasn't recovered. That's why potatoes aren't grown up here. And all we can see is the remains of the old lazy beds. When Granda and I were on the top of Cave Hill, it was covered by wild heather and gorse. The gorse was on fire, and we didn't see anybody. We watched the fires for some time. The flames spread slowly, but Sometimes we could see a small ripple pass over them. Granda said, "I think invisible dragons might be eating the gorse." I agreed, and didn't think much more about it until my friend John Gray told me the following story. A long time ago, in the 1930s, a boy called Michael, who was 12 years of age, lived with his mummy and daddy in Clara Street, East Belfast. He went to Elm Grove Primary School and was miserable, because 3 nasty boys, Scrap, Mitcher and Moisey, bullied him, and his mummy was very house-proud. She was so fussy that she'd have made the sun wipe its feet before it came into the house. The sun never got in because the blinds were kept shut so they wouldn't fade the furniture. Everybody told Michael he lived in a little palace. He thought he'd rather live in a house so he could get covered in mud without being scolded, and his mummy wasn't always polishing furniture or fluffing up cushions. He didn't have any brothers or sisters, so he was very lonely. One day, Scrap crept up behind him and hissed, "I'm going to knock the melt out of you on the way home from school." Michael was so scared that he did a soft smelly one and ran toward the house as fast as his legs would carry him out. Scrap nearly caught him outside a Boxy's shop, but Michael dashed inside and stood there panting. Nobody knew why Boxy was called Boxy. Perhaps it was because he had so many boxes on his shop, or perhaps because he'd once been a boxer. His mother said he was a scruffy old man, but Michael liked him. He was interesting, very wise and full of stories about the time he'd been a sailor and travelled the world. Boxy said, "Well, Michael, is that big bully outside annoying you?" Michael was so upset he couldn't answer. Boxy smiled and said, "An old woman made some apple tart. I think she'll give you a share." He opened the door at the back of the shop and led Michael into his cosy kitchen. "Wife," he said, "here's a young fellow whose tongue is hanging out for a piece of tart." Boxy's wife drew a chair up in front of the American stove. It looked something like the wood-burning stoves we have today, but it burnt coal and had a lid on top so you could drop fuel in on the fire. It was used for cooking. Run! The shop bell sounded. Boxy answered, served a customer, and returned and sat down with a cup of tea in one hand and a piece of tart in the other. "Michael," he said, "ever thought about getting a pet? I think a boy such as you could do with one." "I can't have a pet. I'd love a dog, but Mummy says dogs are smelly and they poo in the yard and cause a mess and drop hairs all over the place. She won't let me have a cat because she says cats give her the shivers. They'd probably scratch her new settee, and I can't have a rabbit or a guinea pig or a hamster or even a fish. She says a pet would be a nuisance and she'd end up looking after it." Foxy said, "You need something special, something magical, something like a dragon. Come to the back door and look at the cave hill. You see that big cliff beyond the ships and cranes? You see the 3 caves where the people used to live? They're deep and black as soot. Dragons live there now. You see patches of smoke drifting over the hill caused by young dragons eating gorse. Tell you what, Michael. Next Saturday, take a wee dander around Smithfield. Go to the pet shop in Gresham Street, walk past it, look carefully at all the doors. There's a magic shop run by an old man. He's got baby dragons and he might give you one. If there's magic in the air, you'll see a special door. I can't describe it, but you'll recognize it. Go inside and see what happens." Michael was so excited he did big, loud, smelly ones, so he sounded like a motorbike all the way home. What the fuck? I guess he was a poor gassy kid. That night he dreamed of dragons. At first he was frightened, but the dragons were friendly. The baby one smiled and rubbed its scaly head against him. He woke up and thought, "I'd love a pet dragon." Next Saturday, Michael got up early, walked down the Castle Reek Road, over Albert Bridge into the centre of Belfast. He went past Big Albert Clock up High Street, along the side of the bank buildings, and into Gresham Street. He stood outside the pet shop and looked at the puppies in the window. There's a cute little black and white one with a curly tail and big eyes. It came over to the window, looked over at Michael, and seemed to say, "I'd love to be your dog." Michael gulped and walked slowly up the street, looking carefully at the doors. Suddenly he saw a strange shop. It didn't have a name. The paintwork was peeling and covered in peculiar signs. There's nothing in the window, just a black curtain. He turned the handle and went in. An old man with a long black beard stood at the back of the shop. He said, "Come this way, Michael, I've been expecting you." He opened the door to another room. It was very dark and everything had a weird glow. The old man went over to a door in the back. It opened a furnace that was burning fiercely inside. He took a shovel and, quick as a flash, thrust it into the flames, pulled it out again, slammed the door shut, and looked at what was on it. Nothing apart from ash and coals. He did the same thing. Nothing. The old man sighed. "Oh dear," he said. "It looks as though baby dragons want to come and live with you. I can only try once more. Here goes, fingers crossed." He put the shovel back in the fire. He took it out. It was a tiny dragon. It was glowing red hot. Its eyes sparkled like diamonds. Wee puffs of smoke came out of his nose. It smiled up at Michael and wagged its tiny spiky tail. "That's your dragon," said the old man. Michael nearly burst into tears. "I haven't any money," he gasped. The old man laughed. "Ah, you can't buy magic. You don't need money. Here you are, here's your dragon." Michael picked up the dragon and put it into his pocket. He was very happy. He walked home, opened the front door and went in. His mummy was sitting on the sofa having a wee cup of tea in her hand. That's one of Ireland's strange sayings. Would you like a wee cup of tea in your hand? Doesn't mean anyone's going to pour tea in your hand. It means, would you like a cup of tea, usually with a biscuit and a piece of cake, sitting beside the fire, rather than at the table. Michael's mummy was tired, so she was sitting on the sofa drinking tea and eating a bit of chocolate cake. She'd spent the whole day polishing, tidying, washing clothes, ironing, cooking, and scrubbing floors at the outside step. When she was tired, she was cross, so she snapped at Michael. "Where have you been all day?" "I walked down to Smithfield and an old man gave me a dragon." "Michael, how many times have I told you mustn't tell stories?" "Honestly, Mommy, I'm telling the truth. Look." He lifted the dragon out of his pocket and held it so his mummy could see it. She screamed. A big flame shot out of the dragon's mouth and scorched one of her slippers. Michael's dad came in through the front door. "That looks interesting," he said. "What is it?" The moment he spoke, the dragon stopped belching fire and flame, looked up, and turned its head toward Michael's dad and smiled. Michael's mother screamed, "It's a wee monster! It scorched one of my slippers!" The dragon turned round, breathed another flame, and scorched the other one. Michael's dad laughed. "Maisie," he said, "I think that dragon doesn't like you hearing me scolding." The dragon immediately stopped belching flames and sat quietly in Michael's hand. Michael's dad said, "Michael, I think you should put the dragon in the coal scuttle. It'd like being in there, and he can see us while we have our tea." And he opened the gate leg table, and Michael helped it set while its mother cooked big fried potato bread, soda bread, bacon, tomatoes, eggs, and sausages. Michael gave the dragon a piece of fried bread. The dragon spat it out. Magic dragons know that fries aren't good for you. They're full of cholesterol that clogs up your arteries so blood can't flow around your body properly if you have them too often. The dragon looked very happy in the coal scuttle. Michael's mum threw it a piece of coal. The dragon caught it in its mouth and everyone laughed. Mum smiled and said, "It really is cute, isn't it?" Once the dishes were washed and dried, they had a lovely night playing with the dragon. Okay. Yeah. So out of place in the rest of the story. I'm like, okay. It seems legit. At bedtime, Mum said, "The dragon can't go to bed with you, Michael. It might set the bedclothes on fire." Dad said, I think it'll be fine in the coal bucket. It looks happy, and if it gets hungry, it can always eat a piece of coal. Mom said, I think we should put it out in the yard to do a poo. Dad said, it's magic, so it doesn't poo. Or do smelly ones. The only trouble is it won't stay long. Magic doesn't hang around. The family had a lovely weekend, the nicest Michael could remember. They went as usual to McQuiston Memorial Church in the morning, had Sunday lunch, and then walked up to Castlereagh Hills. It was a beautiful day, and the dragon enjoyed looking at the marvellous view over Belfast. Dad pointed out Harland and Wolf's shipyard, where the Titanic had been built. Michael tried to look interested. Dad told him that every time they walked up there, grown-ups are like that, aren't they? They keep repeating themselves. Yes, I do. That being said, I used to repeat myself even more when I was younger. On Monday, Michael discovered the dragon had grown. It was still small enough to fit in his school bag, so he took it to school. He popped it some pieces of coal into his pocket so the dragon could have some lunch. He had a great time in the playground, showing the dragon to his friends and explaining how he couldn't keep it for long. Scrapmother and Mosey looked as if they'd like to bully him, but didn't dare come near because he had so many friends around him. After school, Scrapmother and Mosey chased Michael along the Veersbridge Road and caught up with him at the end of Clara Street. Mitcher grabbed him by the shoulders while Scrap and Mosey yelled, "What you've got in his school bag?" Michael was very worried in case they'd hurt his precious dragon, so he held it tight, kicked Mitcher in the shins, and yelled, "Wind your neck in!" The dragon burst out of Michael's school bag. It was furious, so it belched flames. Mosey did a big smelly one. Smelly ones are made of methane gas. It easily set alight, so Mosey's trousers went on fire. Michael laughed and laughed. The dragon set Scrap and Mitcher's trousers on fire so they'd have to go home with bare bums. Their mums were very cross. They didn't believe their son's trousers had been burnt by a dragon. They thought the boys would set their pants on fire by smoking. But this story is amazing. That night the dragon flew away. Michael missed it, but life had changed for him. Mum stopped spending all day polishing and cleaning. He was allowed to bring friends home, and his house became a fun place to live. Scrap, Mitcher, and Mosey didn't bully him anymore. They were scared because they thought Michael might have another dragon in his school bag. Bullies are like that. They're cowards, and if you stand up to them, they'll run away. Best of all, Dad came home with a puppy, and Michael had a pet to love. Michael never forgot his dragon. Sometimes, in bed at night, he heard drumming on the roof, and he knew his dragon was sitting there. When he saw fires burning on Cave Hill, he thought, my dragon and his friends are enjoying fresh air and eating gorse. I bet that's more tasty than lumps of coal. That was cute. Zerb got his bedtime story, and Sassy got another dragon. Dragon! Yeah. I hope you both enjoyed that one. Yeah. I think that'll do it for me for now, though. My voice is getting... That was absolutely precious, yeah. I have a few more bedtime stories ones that I can do. A few. I've quite a few. But that'll do it for me for now. An hour and 30. It's not the longest stream, but it's not the shortest either. Delightful end of the week. Yeah, it was a rougher week. Next week should be better. But as always, y'all are amazing. There will be more spooks to come. Always, always. But in the meantime, do not eat or drink any questionable substances. Uh-oh. I'm caught in the wires. Do not eat or drink any questionable substances. Make smart decisions. Do not die. Dying is absolutely forbidden, and I will see all of you wonderful people at a later time. Take care, guys.